It had been 6 hours, and the engine would not sing. The hangar at Lagos International felt too small for the machine inside it. A Gulfstream-sized private jet sat on jacks, panels open like exposed ribs, a ruined throat of metal and wiring where one engine should have been a taut, obedient muscle. Fluorescent lights hummed, a ceiling fan turned lazily, stirring the warm air that smelled of oil, hot metal, and the faint sourness of overused coffee. A dozen technicians had worked in shift-like bursts, shifting hands, muttered hypotheses, a rotating cast of men in grease-stained shirts who read gauges and shook their heads. Tools were scattered like a small metallic tide around the nacelle: torque wrenches, inspection mirrors, a tablet with schematics. A flight crew in pressed uniforms kept to the periphery. Cameras from a local news crew recorded the impatience of wealthy passengers and the clinical frustration of airline mechanics. When something as rare as a wealthy man's grounded craft sat in your space, every minute stretched like a thin line of cost. The engine refused to spool past idle. It would cough, lurch, and die. The onboard diagnostic reported a sensor fault, then a cascading of warnings that made the control unit lukewarm in its confidence. Systems that should have spoken in obedient numbers babbled contradictory readings. Exhaust temperature rose, then dipped. A small whistle would appear under load, a high, keen sound that no one could quite find at first. They'd tried fuel system checks, rerouted actuators, swapped a module, recalibrated the electronic control box. No joy. Andrew Jacobs watched, fingers drumming on his thigh. He had the watchful stillness of someone used to money being able to bend problems until they yielded. He was not a man who wasted time or patience. Around him, men who depended on that fact moved fast and courteous. Technicians deferred. Suppliers hovered like satellites. Andrew's private plane was an extension of his life, precise, fast, and unforgiving of error. He had paid to be above delays. He had paid to be certain. She walked into that certainty with a dress that had seen better years and shoes that had given up most of their polish. Olivia Williams carried no certificate folder clipped under her arm, no badge in a lanyard. She carried herself like someone who had learned to hold less and observe more. Her hands were scarred in pale lines at the knuckles, fine histories of soldering and late-night work on campus equipment, and her hair was pinned back with a resinous band that trapped stray metal filings. When she stepped into the hangar, everyone noticed because she did not fit the usual profile. No overalls, no corporate ID, no letter of invitation. She fit an angle that made people rearrange the room with sight alone. "Excuse me," she said, voice low but clear. "If you permit, I will fix it." The statement landed like a pebble in a still pond, small, direct, and impossible to ignore. Laughter leaked, polite on a few faces, then dying as a ripple of dismissive comments rose. Sam, the lead engineer, looked at her the way a man measures a new socket in his hand, briefly and with an absent-minded scowl. "We've had the best of them on this for hours," he said. "We've cycled every line. It's either a control unit or an intermittent hydraulic fault." She didn't interrupt him. She walked around the nacelle with casual attention, eyes that saw angles and shadows like a set of instruments. Her movement carried no arrogance. It carried the economy of someone who had been allowed only small windows to act and had learned to make those windows count. Andrew had seen plenty of presumptions in his life. He watched the tug-of-war of authority and indulgence, and then something in him tilted. Maybe it was the exhaustion on his face. 6 hours of fruitless fixes had worn the patience out of flamboyance. Maybe it was the kind of gamble that only the very certain can make, to allow an outsider, against recommendation, to try. He stood and walked closer. "Go ahead. One try, but no fools." Olivia nodded. The crowd rearranged itself into a ring of polite distance. Cameras leaned forward. Sam lifted an eyebrow, but stepped aside. The cabin fan hummed, and the metal tasted of heat. She opened a toolkit, a small grimy box she had carried on purpose, the kind of thing packed with items you keep for emergencies because they have to work and you have no time for substitutes. It contained a few precision screwdrivers, a looped inspection mirror with a telescoping handle, a small flash mount light, a small spool of insulating tape, a length of rubber sleeve, and an old slip of university ID tucked deep between two cloths. The ID had her name and a picture from several years before, olive skin before it grew tired, eyes bright. She touched it for a heartbeat in private. "What's your name?" Sam asked, not unkindly now, curiosity edging his skepticism. "Olivia Williams." He gave a short laugh that was not cruel. "Got any credentials?" She did not answer the way the room expected. Instead, she crouched by the engine, the nacelle a dark mouth that swallowed her small light. Up close, the engine revealed the familiar geometry of metallic vanes and braided wiring harnesses, an anatomy any student of turbines would recognize. Her fingers moved like someone recalling a language. She began by listening. There is a particular patience to listening with your hands, placing fingers on cooling cowls, letting the muscle vibration of the structure speak. Olivia's palm found a clamp near the bleed air line, and a seam there where something didn't sit right. Her fingers found a place a little off the specified groove, as if the clamp had been hurriedly seated and never fully settled. Under load, that misalignment would allow a microscopic leak, a whistling exhalation of air that at certain RPM and pressure would disturb the sensor readings downstream. It would create a ripple of false alarm in the control unit. The software would compensate for a problem that did not exist, and in doing so, mismanage other parameters until the system balked. It was a small cruelty, an ordinary clamp in the wrong place, the sort of thing that could be missed by a hurried eye and an impatient schedule of checks. Also, a cracked sensor insulation on a harness she could only see with a mirror and a patient light. The insulation was hairline split, perhaps a consequence of a chafed section rubbing on a bracket, allowing fine moisture or electromagnetic interference to bleed and produce intermittent, falsified data. She ran a finger along the clamp and found the groove it wanted. It slid into place with that faint, unmistakable click of something fitting as it should. Then she turned her attention to the sensor wire, peeling back a thin veil of braided insulation to reveal the corroded sheath. Carefully, with the patience of someone sewing a very small seam, she wrapped the exposed section with insulating tape and then shepherded a piece of rubber sleeve over the repair. Her hands moved with geometric precision. Strip, wrap, seal. Sam watched with a tightening in his jaw. He stepped in instinctively, offering, "You sure?" "Hold the control," Olivia said, not looking up. "I'll want a spool up. Keep the external pumps on manual." They obliged. The engine responded to the first rotation with a hesitant intake of breath. The small whistle that had been present earlier shifted, it lilted, and then went away when she adjusted the clamp. The control unit, deprived of its phantom complaints, stopped compensating and allowed the engine's routines to follow their proper choreography. Olivia's fingers tightened on a hose clamp, checked torque, and stepped back. "Don't touch anything else," she said to the room, as if she were reminding herself. 2 minutes. When Sam eased the throttle, the announcer of failures, the warning lights, the shaky telemetry, settled. Numbers stabilized on the tablet. Exhaust tones cooled and evened out. The engine spun incriminatingly smooth, a human hand and a small piece of tape and common sense having quieted the false alarms. There was a breathless beat where the hangar seemed to be filled with air, and then the sound of membership returning. People realized the engine was not only starting, but steady. A small cheer began near the tool benches and grew. Andrew laughed with something like release. Reporters pushed forward. The camera caught the wide, exhausted smile that spread on Olivia's face, a smile that had practiced being grateful for small mercies. Sam approached her after silence had remodeled into applause. He was the kind of mechanic who liked to touch the truth of his field. He extended a hand, covered in grease, a simple recognition. "You were right about the clamp and the sensor." "No miracles," Olivia said, voice flat, because she had no use for that word. Just listening. They ran 2 complete cycles, full power checks, diagnostics under simulated load. The engine behaved as engines were meant to behave. The Gulfstream's once stubborn heart sang a steady, confident note. Phones recorded it. A crew member lifted a microphone, breathless. The narrative that would make its rounds on social feeds later that day wanted to wrap everything in a single line. The homeless girl who fixed a billionaire's jet engine. It was a good line. It would be repeated with both reverence and a kind of hunger for a tidy moral. But of the facts, the engine had failed because a clamp had been seated wrong and a sensor wire had worn through its insulation. The cure had been human attention and a hand steady enough to repair it. That is what made the fix believable and miraculous in a way that did not require magic. Andrew walked to her, close enough to smell the tang of her breath and the faint metallic dust on her skin. He shook her hand. His grip was firm but not showy. "You have a name?" "Olivia Williams," she said again. "Olivia," he repeated, tasting the name like a question. "Where did you learn to do this?" "I studied at Nigeria Aerospace University," she said, words clipped. Before... She didn't finish. The clause hung in the air like a small fault line. Andrew watched her for a moment. He had seen people break at different seams. He had given money, promises, and brief private opportunities that were as transactional as they were rhetorical. What he offered now was different. He offered an opening without an ultimatum. "You saved us a day and a lot of trouble. Come to the office. I have someone who'll pay attention to what you know. I like competence. I like people who can keep their heads in a noisy hangar. You ought to have better shoes." A laugh, near sad and pure, escaped Olivia. Compliments had never been currency for her. "I don't want charity. I don't either. Opportunity, help, a hand that doesn't come with strings." The crowd thinned into a discreet ring as Andrew's assistant arranged an impromptu meeting. Sam, who had been skeptical, now wore a look of mild, begrudging respect. He stepped away, pulling another mechanic with him to check a secondary system. Reporters clustered at the outer ring, already composing their headlines. There was a short private conversation in Andrew's office, glass and wood, and the kind of understated wealth that made no claim beyond its presence. Olivia sat on a chair that felt like a luxury to someone who had been sitting on curbs for months. She unfolded the past in the small, measured sentences of someone who had learned not to let their grief demand more attention than it deserved. "My parents were both technicians," Olivia said. Her hands found each other in her lap. "They worked on aircraft before I was born. We lived in Jos. I won a scholarship to study aerospace because that's what the world looked like from our house. Engines and flight, and the idea that things could be held together by skilled hands. University was good. I was good at it. But when they died," she did not dramatize it. She told it cleanly, "A accident on a damp night. 2 small shops burned. Lives gone." The university record that had promised a future turned into a document listing a bright name and fading support. Bereavement arrived like a slow, practical thief. Without them, she could not afford rent. Without them, doors that once opened closed. She slept on benches in the daytime and in the back of a library at night, until even the library felt too public for someone whose grief wanted to be private. She taught herself smaller trades, small soldering jobs, ad hoc fixes for people who couldn't pay much. She kept her hands ready. Andrew listened, not as a man searching for leverage, but as someone who'd learned to recognize the difference between story and skill. He did not offer platitudes. He offered concrete options. "We fly to London tonight. I can introduce you to colleagues at JJ Jet Maintenance. There are openings in an apprentice program there. If you want this, you can come." That offer could have been a savior's cloak. Olivia's face registered no urgency to be saved. It registered the awareness that opportunity was as rare as it was precise. "Why me?" she asked, wanting to know if it was pity. Andrew considered the question as if tasting a note before answering. because I fixed an impossible problem with the simplest tool, attention, and because I'm tired of the same names being given every chance. I fund competence when I find it. I'll make sure you have the travel, a recommendation, the introductions. The rest is on you." She thought of the nights on the streets, the palms of her hands aching with the memory of a soldering iron and the muffled comfort of a slow engine. She thought of a name on a university transcript she had once let herself believe would open doors. She thought of dignity as something that could be restored by small acts that required work and courage. "Okay," she said finally, because saying nothing would be a different kind of refusal. Andrew's assistant arranged things with the brisk efficiency of someone used to making private plans public in minutes. A courier dropped off a spare set of clothes for Olivia, a simple dress, a tailored blazer that fit oddly at the shoulders, shoes that pinched, then promised relief. She changed quietly in a back room near the hangar, buttoning collars and learning a new vocabulary of pockets and seams. There was a small, almost comic private moment as she tried on gloves that were too white and a jacket that felt like a borrowed accent. Sam found her after the greetings and the logistics had been agreed upon. He carried a thermos and a pair of old, large sunglasses. "Don't get too dazzled," he said, more as a warning than an admonition. "London's not a church. It's a market of ideas and insurance contracts. You're good, just don't let people steal your work." "I won't," she said. "I know how to watch." A city of whispers followed them in small ways. Reporters wanted a line. The airport security wanted to know who would be on the passenger list. Andrew's private jet would depart that night. He'd arranged everything with the kind of care that comes from a life long used to the levers of power. Olivia accepted the introduction to a representative from JJ Jet Maintenance, a short, businesslike woman named Claire, who had the polite dryness of someone who had seen too many bright-eyed recruits. Claire made sure Olivia's name and a note of the story were in the company's records. There would be a preliminary interview in London. There would be a place to sleep. There would be training plans. The technicalities were spoken with the crispness of people who knew how to translate compassion into logistics. Before boarding, Olivia walked alone to the tarmac. The Gulf Stream's shadow lay long on the concrete. The evening air was close and smelled of jet fuel in the city. She looked back at Lagos, the skyline, the tangle of traffic lights like fireflies, the slow pulse of a city that had never learned to be quiet. Her hands were steady. Inside the plane, she sat in a cabin that smelled of leather and money. The air conditioning hummed at the precise tempo of comfort. Andrew sat across from her. He looked at her the way a man studies a fund, sizing risk and return, but with a small human softness now that the problem was solved. Airborne, Lagos shrunk to a scatter of light. "You'll meet my son in London," Andrew said casually, as if talking about someone who'd simply be part of the orchestra. "His name is Jerry. He keeps to the quieter kind of trouble." "Noted," Olivia said, and let the word fall. Her tiredness threaded through her speech like the grain of an old board. It was present, but it did not break her. Andrew leaned back. "You know what privilege is like. It gives you a lot. Guidelines, people who will smile at you at events, and sometimes," he hesitated, "sometimes it makes people forget how to listen. I want to try to change that among people I work with. I want to make sure this doesn't become another story where someone like you disappears after the applause." Olivia's eyes tracked the interior lights as they dimmed for takeoff. She considered his words as if they were a small map. "I don't want you to change the world for me. I want a chance to change my world with my hands." Andrew nodded. "Fair." Outside the window, Lagos grew smaller. Inside, Olivia pulled her old university ID from the small toolkit she'd absent-mindedly carried in her bag. The picture hovered, an earlier version of herself that seemed both near and distant. She traced the embossed letters with a fingertip. There was a tiny loop in her chest where grief had once lived and where, for the first time in months, a pulse of possibility had begun to thrum. A flight attendant offered a blanket. Olivia accepted, then set it aside to look at the panel in front of her. She could not pretend that the future had unfurled neatly into prosperity. She knew the hard truth that opportunities could be as fragile as engine clamps misaligned by a degree. She also knew that skill was a stubborn thing, once forged, difficult to remove. In the cabin behind them, a reporter called Andrew's name in a half-joking, half-demanding tone. "Mr. Jacobs, this woman, what would you say to those who say it's a parable, the homeless girl who saved the day?" Andrew's answer was tempered like tempered steel. "I'd say it's a failure of our systems when such competence goes unnoticed, and that we've all got a responsibility to notice better." He was talking about the world in the measured terms of someone who had found power and wanted to apply it differently. Olivia listened and felt a curious absence of relief and an unexpected flicker of something else, watchfulness. This was not the endgame. It was a beginning that needed tending. They landed in London under a sky that promised rain. The terminals seemed very bright and very civil. People in coats moved briskly with the discipline of those who had built lives around schedules. As they stepped into the arrival lounge, Olivia shivered at the cool air and felt a hand of hesitation, an old reflex to check pockets, know where water is, hold a day bag like a shield. A journalist from an international outlet asked her to repeat the story for a camera. She gave a short, precise version and left out the parts that would have made it melodrama: the sleeping on benches, the nights counted like missing pages, the way grief had taught her to keep hands busy. She kept to the facts: wrong clamp in the wrong groove, sensor insulation cracked, reposition, rewrap, test. She left the rest because the rest was private and had nothing to do with the fix. Outside the airport, Andrew's driver ushered them into a black car, the city's light bent on the polished paint. Olivia noted details in the shape of buildings, the sound of English being shaped differently than it had back home. There was an ease to the way people moved here, and a caution as if the world were practiced at giving and taking at the same time. She felt neither awe nor entitlement. She felt a strange clarity. That night, in a small, company-arranged hotel that smelled faintly of lemon and the possibility of sleep, Olivia lay on a bed that didn't squeak and listened to a city she'd only seen on screens. Her phone had a message, a curt line from Claire, confirming the appointment, a number to call the next morning, and an attached PDF of the documents she would need to show at the headquarters. There was nothing magical in it. It was a chain of emails and privileges that had lined up because a billionaire had noticed her competence. It would be nimble if she seized it. It would be fragile if she did not. She drifted into half-sleep, thinking of the engine in Lagos and the way the misaligned clamp had been almost invisible until pressure changed the system's equilibrium. She thought of how something small could break the flow of the whole, and how something equally small, an attentive hand, could restore it. In the night, the city murmured like a distant engine, and she made an unspoken vow: never again would she waste her skill by hiding. The next day came with cloud and the first real chill she'd felt in months. At the JJ Jet Maintenance Headquarters, a tidy building with the quiet insistence of well-oiled bureaucracy, she waited in a reception area that smelled faintly of polished wood and industrial coffee. There were framed photos of jets on the walls, and a plaque that listed the company's founding. She read each word like someone trying to learn the grammar of a life she might now inhabit. Executives in narrow ties filed past with the efficient indifference of people who sort the world by procedures. A man named Jeffrey escorted her to a meeting room and left with a polite nod. Claire arrived with a folder and a way of walking that suggested experience in preempting missteps. The room was long, with a table that could seat a dozen and a screen at one end. On the table lay a simulation kit waiting for the test. She had expected hostility. What she found instead was a layered assessment, like the careful test of an instrument. The executives were not cruel. They were cautious. One by one, they asked questions not of sympathy, but of competence. If you were faced with a sensor that reads intermittently high temperature despite consistent FI numbers, what would you do? How do you isolate bleed air pressure anomalies without tearing down the whole unit? Olivia answered not with narratives, but with steps. Listen, isolate, check clamps and harness routing, trace the wire to the connector to rule out intermittent chafing, test under simulated load, reseat and rewrap. She described the process of listening to the structure, of following the air with an inspection mirror, of anticipating how a misseated clamp could turn a harmless hiss into a catalyst for misdiagnosis. The executives nodded. Sometimes the boardroom's schematic language was translated simply into hands-on metaphors, and they liked that. They liked that she could turn complex checking sequences into crisp orders. There was one question that stuck. How do you lead a team that resists an outsider's instructions? Olivia considered it honestly. By being clear and steady, by making sure the team knows what we are trying to prevent, by teaching them to notice the small noises, and by being the first to get my hands dirty. Such answers landed well in corridors where someone with money was listening for the efficiency of speech. Claire smiled with professional relief. Jeffrey tapped a pen. The final invitation was not immediate permission, but an offer to prove oneself, a demonstration under controlled conditions on a simulator in 2 days, before a panel and some invited press. It was not the boardroom seat, it was an examination, public and narrow. Olivia accepted on the spot. In the interlude before the demonstration, Andrew introduced Olivia to a few people, including Jerry. He was different from his father in the way he moved, a younger man with a gentle, curious interest in ideas, rather than the blunt acquisition of things. He had eyes that kept their distance, as if wanting to know someone before deciding how much to invest. He greeted Olivia with a quiet kindness that had none of the patronizing tilt she feared. They talked about specifics, the different behaviors of bleed systems under tropical versus temperate climates, the way sensor wires war against brackets, the finer points of torque settings. Olivia spoke as if teaching, and Jerry listened as if he found a subject he wanted to linger on. A small tenderness began as conversation, a shared joke about airline coffee, a mutual grimace over university cafeteria food. It was not a rescue, it was companionship forming slowly, like threads woven into a seam. Jerry asked about Lagos the way someone asked because he wants to learn, not to fashion a story. Olivia found herself answering in a way she didn't expect. The tone between them was light but grounded. There was an ease in the presence of someone who did not glance at how the world might rearrange them. But underneath that quiet softening, Olivia remained wary. She had seen how admiration could harden into claim. She had learned not to accept compliments that came with unspoken expectations. In the days that followed, she prepared for the demonstration. She pored over simulation models and practiced the phrasing of her diagnosis into a public-friendly sequence. She rehearsed the checks and the order of steps. The test would be in a controlled environment, a virtual sensor failure, programmed to create the same chain of false alarms. She would need to explain as she worked, to make the boardroom see not only the fix, but the reasoning. She practiced speaking clearly, without sacrificing the pace of action. Outside the training rooms, Lagos whispered news. The clip of the engine coming to life under her hands went viral in African feeds, a 2-minute highlight repeated with proud captions. Her name began to carry a gravity she wasn't accustomed to. Some nights when she checked her phone, there were messages from strangers thanking her, asking for help, or offering praise. There were also the quieter messages, a note from a former professor who'd seen the clip and wrote simply, "Remember who you are. We were proud then, we are proud now." It was small but sustained. The public attention was both boon and burden. It made doors open but also invited eyes that measured and judged. She trained, she slept, and she ate with a rhythm that started to resemble normalcy. Yet in the small hours, when the city outside her window was still, she could feel the old hunger in another form, the hunger to belong to a craft, to keep the hands busy with the logic of metal and wire, to anchor grief into practice rather than let it unravel into passivity. That hunger was its own kind of loyalty. On the eve of the simulation, Andrew gave her a short, quiet piece of advice. Whatever they test you on, answer with your hands and your voice. People will judge you by both. Be the steady thing in the room. She took the advice and made it her compass. The next morning, the boardroom filled with people from different countries, their faces polite and skeptical in equal measure. Cameras were present, but not obtrusive. The simulation began, a sequence of alarms initiated by a false temperature rise, a spiking EGT, followed by abrupt compensatory trims. Olivia walked up to the console with her practiced calm. She explained the probable cause in plain language and then walked through the steps to confirm: isolation of the sensor, visual inspection, reseating of connectors, checking for chafed insulation, and testing under increased load. She demonstrated how to use an inspection mirror, how to listen for a minuscule whistle that could only be heard at certain RPM, and how clamps must sit in intended grooves to avoid airflow distortion. The simulation responded as she predicted. Where the software had been programmed to flounder in its alarms, she guided the operators to read the signs differently. The room noticed the difference between someone who learned her answers from books and someone who had learned to read complaints of metal with her fingertips. At the end of the demonstration, the applause was not thunderous, but real. Jeffrey leaned in like a man making a ledger and nodded his head as if entries of approval were being ticked. Claire smiled in a professional way that suggested the company had found exactly the type of person it looked for: competent, teachable, and resilient. They offered her a provisional role, head of a new technical outreach in Africa, with a mandate to train staff and supervise key maintenance lines in Lagos. It was a chance to return, not as a visitor, but as a leader. It was an opening big enough to muffle the smallness she'd known for so long. Olivia accepted with both the wary humility of someone who had learned to count her gains and the quiet conviction of someone who knew how to work. She understood what would come with the appointment. Yes, recognition, a salary, access to tools that were not always available, and the respect of a formal title. But she also understood the other side: envy in corners of the hangar, the slow machinations of people who might resent a rapid ascent, and the delicate politics of appearing as someone appointed by an outsider rather than one who had climbed internal ranks. There was a small note of tension in the plan that none of them mentioned out loud. In Lagos, Mr. Adewale, the regional director, had been absent from the early greetings. His name hadn't come up, but he was a man known for a certain fastidious adherence to hierarchy. A new appointment that skipped steps would land like a pebble in his carefully raked garden. Olivia felt the shadow of that pebble as a vague caution. She had not yet met him. For now, she allowed herself a cautious optimism. She flew back to Lagos a week later with the paper confirming her appointment, signed by the regional board, a modest company ID clipped to her jacket, and the sense of a responsibility that would require more than skill: diplomacy, patience, and the subtle craft of leadership. On the tarmac, the hangar looked both smaller and somehow more ready to take her on. Engines hummed with the intimate knowledge that their lives were sustained by small actions and steady hands. The crew greeted her with a mixture of curiosity and a tentative respect. Sam shook her hand with an almost familial warmth now and said, "Good to have you back." There was, beneath the welcome, a barely concealed tension. Radio chatter suggested a backlog of clients with urgent needs, schedules that could punish any misstep. There were whispers of a major Gulfstream client arriving soon, a high-profile job that would be an opportunity to cement her place or to cause doubters to speak louder. She breathed in the familiar smells: oil, hot metal, the starch of a world she loved. She touched a panel as she passed, seeking the comfort of activity. The work ahead would be rigorous. It would test not only her technical skill, but her ability to steer the politics of a place that sometimes preferred to preserve its hierarchies rather than embrace the disruption of talent where it was least expected. Standing in the hangar, with the Gulfstream's polished body reflecting the fluorescent lights, Olivia felt the old tension, fear braided with hunger, loosen a touch. She was no longer a woman who fixed whatever was urgently in front of her for spare change. She was someone with a mandate and a name on a badge. The future would not be easy. The engine she had once coaxed back to life under the glare of a billionaire's gaze had become something like a promise to herself, to those who had taught her, to the small inner ledger of competence she had kept against the world. There was a knock on the office glass. Jerry stood there, carrying a cup of coffee like an offering. He had been assigned to support her projects, a convenient coincidence or thoughtful arrangement, she could not tell. He smiled without ceremony. He said, "Thought you might need this." She accepted it, their fingers brushing, a small transfer of warmth. He asked quietly, "How are you doing?" "Steady," she answered. It was true. Steady had become the thing she aimed for. It allowed work to be done and judgment to be made in the clean air of facts. It kept grief from becoming a declamatory force. It made leadership possible. They went out to the tarmac together. A Gulf Stream idled nearby, its engine a humming promise of controlled power. The client who owned it wanted a quick inspection of a bleed valve that had started to stick, an inconvenience that could make flights uncomfortable and sometimes dangerous if left unattended. The job would be visible. It would test the team's dynamics. It was exactly the kind of assignment that, if handled poorly, would fuel whisper networks. If handled well, would solidify her credibility. Sam handed over a multi-page checklist. Olivia unfolded it like a map. She briefed the crew with a short, clear plan. Isolate the bleed system, check the valve actuation for grit and corrosion, run a controlled cycling, and verify that sensor feedback matched manual gauges. She assigned tasks with firmness and a readiness to get hands dirty first. The work itself was precise, boring in the way true craft often is, and then thrilling in the sudden clarity of diagnosis. The bleed valve had a sticky edge where condensation had pooled, and micro-pitting began the slow erosion of function. It took a methodical cleaning, a replacement of a small seal ring, and careful lubrication with a compound the company kept for such marginal points. The team moved under her guidance with the tidy choreography of people who trust their leader to order the tempo. The client watched from the doorway, a man who'd charted the plane for a business trip. He stepped forward and shook her hand when the test returned green. "You saved the day again." He meant it, plainly, without a fanfare. Men like him were often happy to praise what might prevent an expensive failure. But the victory was tasted briefly. In the shade of congratulations, a rumor had already begun. Mr. Adewale had heard of the quick ascendancy. He had been a man who valued his network, and such appointments were not his alone to sanction, he said in private conversations that reeked of protocol. The first note of opposition was small, a schedule change that complicated a training session, a request for extra sign-offs. Olivia noticed the bureaucratic resistance like a bruising that came after confident work. She made a mental note. Politics had their own clogs and needed cleaning. That evening, after the Gulf Stream was cleared and the client had left satisfied, the staff lingered in the low light of the hangar, sharing small food and bigger stories. Jerry lingered near Olivia, speaking of the ideal torque values for specific clamps and the way weather influenced the wear on harnesses. The conversation drifted to small domesticities, the shape of home, the rituals that made ordinary evenings bearable. Olivia spoke of an old radio her father had once owned, of the way they tuned in to learn of weather and news, of how voices could set a cadence in one's life. Jerry listened as if each memory was a small gift. They did not notice the camera at first. A journalist from earlier that week had returned to see the aftermath and captured snippets of camaraderie. When the footage later circulated, those scenes were edited into a narrative arc. The homeless girl had not only fixed a plane, but found a place among people who respected her. The internet loves tidy arcs. Life rarely is. But even as the warmth from shared work and quiet conversation filled the hangar, a slow, steady tension threaded the air. Olivia felt the shape of a challenge rising like pressure under a skin. She knew the strains that would come with being a leader who had not paid full dues. She knew that Mr. Adewale would not disappear, that there were pockets of resentment in any institution. She had also learned never to confuse optimism with naivete. She left the hangar that night with a small sense of victory, her wallet heavier with a pay advance, her badge clipped to a lanyard now, and the conviction that the next steps would require more than competence. They would require resilience, allies, and the practice of making enemies into colleagues where possible. As she walked away, she looked back at the Gulf Stream, its metal skin glinting under the floodlights. The plane had been a problem that asked only for listening and steady hands. The world, she had learned, was asking for a different sort of listening to people's fears, processes, and the subtle mechanics of power. She slept that night in the apartment the company had arranged, Spartan but private. She dreamed briefly of the open cowls and engines like sleeping creatures. In the morning, she received an email from Andrew, a short line about persistence and the expectation that work done well would eventually be heard by ears that mattered. There was also an invitation to a small private dinner where industry figures would mingle and where Olivia was expected to be introduced as the new head. She hesitated. The dinner would be small and important. Industry people, executives who could smooth the path for training contracts and parts lines, and unavoidably, the very networks that could make or complicate her assignment. It would also be a public stage. Olivia told herself it was necessary. She accepted. If this kind of story inspires you, tap like and subscribe. There, a brief thread to the world beyond the hangar. The restaurant was quiet in the way of places where money was practiced politely. Lamps burned low over linens. Knives made precise sounds. Andrew moved through the room with the ease of someone who knew the choreography. He introduced her lightly. This is Olivia Williams, the technician from Lagos. Names were exchanged like pegs quickly slotted into plans. Conversation shifted. Aircraft leasing, training modules, the needs of growing African markets. Mr. Adewale was there, as if summoned by the etiquette of presence. He was cool in plain clothes and kept his attention like a ledger. He offered Olivia a smile that did not reach his eyes and spent his course asking careful questions about procedure, not about how she felt. The tone was professional but pointed, a test disguised as small talk. Mr. Adewale's manner suggested he believed companies should move according to chains of command, not headlines. For him, a named appointment that bypassed certain customary processes looked like a staff rumor that required neat containment. At the table, conversation moved easily until the report of Lagos rang into the room, an update that suggested schedules were tightening and a Gulfstream in West Africa would need faster turnaround times. Adewale's expression hardened. He implied, not too discreetly, that haste often invites error. Experience is earned, he said. We cannot afford optics to be confused with competence. Olivia answered with a small, steady smile that avoided being defensive. Experience is also the willingness to notice what others don't, she said, quiet enough that some missed the point. Jerry caught it, and his glance warmed. He liked the way she phrased things, simple, precise, and not pleading for approval. Andrew watched the exchange with a respect that was less public than it was firm. He didn't need to pander to anyone at the table. He needed results. The moment passed. Conversations resumed toward quieter matters, contracts, and weather windows. The evening next day unfolded into work, introductions, signatures, travel authorizations. Olivia moved through the motions with a new rhythm. The appointments mattered. So did the small slowness of learning how to file expense claims and decline offers that came with strings. She refused flattery that wanted to reshape her and accepted help that offered tools. Jerry stayed nearby in a way that was not theatrical. He was attentive and curious, more companion than protector. They shared small confidences, the taste of bad coffee on overseas trains, the stubborn satisfaction of a job finished right. There was tenderness, simple and reciprocal, that formed without fanfare. Back in Lagos, the web of corporate life showed its true colors. Small resistances became a pattern, delays in procurement, a training schedule shifted, vendor invoices misplaced. Nothing dramatic enough to be a scandal, but persistent enough to strain plans. At first, Olivia attributed the friction to bureaucracy and growing pains.
Then a delivery did not arrive when it should have. A batch of specialized seals and sleeve kits dispatched for a scheduled line maintenance vanished into logistics limbo. The client grew restless. A public charter had to be delayed, a wet nightmare for an operator who billed by the hour and valued time like a currency. Adewale expressed concern, in an email copied to the regional board, that proper procurement channels had not been followed. Olivia called the supplier herself. The team that handled logistics moved like a map of half-traced lines. Each person she reached promised resolution. Each call ended with the same polite assurance: the parts were delayed. Then Sam discovered a misrouted note in the procurement system. Someone had altered the shipping port, causing the containers to sit at a neighboring hub for 2 extra days. It was a small change with the effect of a dropped stone. Recovery would cost time and reputation. It was Jerry who first spoke the word she had been trying not to say aloud. "Sabotage?" he asked, too quiet for any but her to hear. Olivia held the word in her chest a moment and let it settle into a shape that the facts could wear. She was cautious about blame. She preferred evidence. The pattern of delays, the odd routing, the timing, the week after her appointment, needed more than suspicion. She asked Sam to pull access logs, to trace approvals, to check who had clearance for changes. Sam, now firmly in her corner, worked evenings, his skepticism softened into an engaged loyalty. When the logs were parsed, they showed a series of approvals from a regional terminal account, an account that was in practice controlled by Adewale's office. It was not conclusive proof of intent, but it was enough to call a meeting. Olivia sat across from Adewale with other managers present. He smiled with the thin politeness of someone whose station felt under a slight pressure. "Accusations are serious. If there's something wrong in procurement, we fix the system, not make claims about people." Olivia's answer was a calm ledger of procedure. "We fix the plane first, we trace the error back, and then we clean the process. The priority is the client and the crew. We can do both." Adewale agreed to a compromise he framed as caution, an audit and a multi-signature approval for the outstanding orders. It bought time. In the waiting, the client's charter remained threatened. Olivia could have accepted the delay as inevitable. Instead, she chose what the craft had taught her: mend what you can with the tools at hand and make the rest fail-safe. There was a Gulf Stream in the bay with a problem that could be managed on-site, a bleed air controller that was intermittently tripping, snuffing out cabin pressurization at critical times. The component was not fully failed. It was sensitive to minor airflow distortions and to the condition of the hose clamps that fed the ductwork. Replacing the part would have been clean, but required the delayed seals. Olivia proposed a provisional fix, a reroute of the feed, and a temporary sleeve, a mechanical workaround that respected safety margins while buying time for proper parts. It would require clear delegation, careful testing, and a signed waiver. Adewale balked at the waiver, citing liability and precedent. The client, meanwhile, threatened to move the contract elsewhere. Olivia called Andrew and asked for the authority to act. Andrew, in a voice that had learned to measure giving by risk, granted the temporary sign-off with the condition that a full diagnostic would follow within hours. "Do the right mitigation," he said. "Document every step." Olivia pulled her team onto the tarmac. She worked with the rhythm of someone who trusts hands and words equally. Sam and 2 junior mechanics listened as she walked through the temporary procedure. Jerry stood to the side, hands in coveralls, refusing to let his role be only ornamental. He had learned the language of the hangar and could hand a tool with proper torque without the risk of breaking something by clumsy eagerness. The reroute took longer than the easy fix would have. Olivia's hands moved in the almost slow choreography of a surgeon, deliberate, precise. She talked the team through each move, naming torques, checking clearances, testing for thermal expansion paths. They applied an improvised rubber sleeve and nested it into a custom-length clamp. They tested under controlled pressure and watched the system respond. When full cycling returned green, the client's manager exhaled in a way that accepted the practical solution as enough.
The relief was real and immediate. A charter that would have canceled was allowed to proceed under a strict dispatch protocol. The story of Olivia's field innovation spread in company channels, framed as the kind of pragmatic leadership the company claimed to value. But the victory did not erase the undercurrents. A short, anonymous note reached the regional board, questioning the cleanliness of the temporary fix. Adewale had not been overtly vindictive. He had the more effective power of process, a tool that could turn concern into a bureaucratic wedge. In the days after, internal paperwork increased. Audits were requested. The company's legal counsel asked for copies of procedures. Olivia met each request with a calm pile of documentation, test logs, torque sheets, recorded sensor values. She knew how to keep technical evidence in order. It diminished the force of rumor. It did not eliminate it. Meanwhile, the tenderness between Olivia and Jerry continued to grow less like a rescue and more like companionship. They built a private cadence. Late-night conversations about calibration curves turned into slower talk about what home might mean. Shared sandwiches in the back of the hangar became rituals. Jerry was patient in a way that did not attempt to overcorrect her guardedness. He did not ask her to perform gratitude as if it were a debt. He came to listen because he wanted to learn who she was when her hands were not busy. Months folded into a rhythm of small wins. Olivia's training programs started on schedule. She recruited young mechanics from local technical schools, insisting on apprenticeship terms that paid a living wage. She taught them how to listen to engines, how to use mirrors and torches, and how to read the tiny complaints of metal. Her team began to move with both pride and efficiency. Reported downtimes decreased. Clients returned with commendations, and small contracts for maintenance training flowed in. Not everyone applauded. Adewale's public resistance softened into a private campaign, boardroom whispers that suggested Olivia had bypassed procedure, that appointments made from outside had created unhealthy precedents. He cultivated allies who preferred the old progress ladders and worried about the optics of rapid elevation. There were practical reprisals, a delayed approval here, a request for a supplementary training audit there. Each irritation had the slow grain of intent. Then came the moment that demanded more than competence, a high-stakes inspection for a government contractor. The required certification would need signatures from the regional office. Adewale held the pen. He suggested that Olivia's team should wait for a joint inspection, a delay of a week. Waiting would mean the contract could be given to a competitor. Olivia could not watch her trainee's work be transferred to another hangar, like a bouquet plucked from its stem. She called Andrew for advice, and found in him the same measured support he had earlier given her, an encouragement to act within legal bounds and to document everything. She organized a joint inspection and invited neutral observers. She prepared logs, trained her team to present the work, and when the inspectors arrived, she led them through a meticulous demonstration, a step-by-step show of checks, tests, and the rationale behind each decision. She let the probes fall where they may. The inspectors saw records and hands that knew how to interpret the signals metal made. The certification was granted, the contractor signed. It was not triumphal, it was ordinary and final. The reward was practical, work that sustained paychecks and a modest expansion in training quotas. Adewale's campaign lost traction then, but not entirely. He shifted strategy and began working through the board to propose a review of leadership appointments company-wide, an initiative framed as governance, not personal. It was a messier threat because it could be argued as necessary oversight. Olivia found herself summoned to a board meeting where policies were discussed, where the terms precedent and risk profile were used in a way that held the edges of consequence. Andrew sat in the room as a quiet presence.
When Adewale suggested a review, Andrew countered crisply. We audit everything we need to, but we will not allow fear of change to stall operations that keep fleets flying. The board voted to keep Olivia in her role while a procedural review took place. The reprieve was narrow and conditional. She understood that stability had its cost, that leadership often meant living with a tension between praise and scrutiny. She continued to work, and her work kept the hangar humming. The personal life that had quietly formed around that professional life moved forward more boldly. Jerry and Olivia married in a small ceremony beneath an open tarmac awning, engines distant and content. There were mechanics in grease-splattered shirts, a few executives who had become true allies, Sam in a jacket he didn't usually wear, and Andrew standing near the edge with the steady look of someone who had put his weight behind a choice and was content with the result. The wedding was not an escape from the past, it was an incorporation of it, the vows reflecting not only affection, but a shared commitment to the kind of life that holds work and family in balance. Months later came the birth of their son. They named him Jonathan, not a public spectacle, but a quiet naming that smelled of private reverence. For Olivia, the choice was a bridge to the small domestic legacy she had long believed had been lost when her parents died. Andrew, with an awkward but sincere warmth, held the boy and smiled at his daughter-in-law as if the edges of his life had been softened by family. These milestones did not erase the political weather entirely. The board's procedural review continued to stir rumors on slow days. Envy had migrated into strategic coldness in a few corners, but the work on the tarmac flowed, and under Olivia's leadership, the training program multiplied the number of certified technicians. Young people who had once seen maintenance work as a last resort now saw an apprenticeship as a path to a steady life. That, more than any headline, became the measure of what Olivia had built. Years later, at a low-key celebration for the anniversary of her hiring, Andrew watched as Olivia walked through the hangar with Jonathan against her chest, his breath a tiny engine itself. He had done more than give her a boarding pass to London. He had opened a door and then stepped back to let the work speak for itself. He had found in her a rare, practical virtue, a particular application of attention that chain reactions always needed. "Do you ever regret taking the chance?" he asked, once, the two of them alone beside an idling turboprop that shivered gently in the evening. He thought she would say no, because practical people tend to measure outcomes, but Olivia surprised him. "Sometimes," she said, "there are costs. You have to live with the exposure of being watched, the small betrayals. But I don't regret it, because it gave me something to build with." Andrew nodded. "Good," he said. "We need more people who build." The hangar never quite stopped smelling of oil and effort. Sometimes, in the quiet hours before dawn, Olivia would walk past a row of engines and imagine the small sound of the clamp that had once been misseated, a reminder of how little can unbalance a system and how careful hands can set it right. She knew there would be other storms, a new director who would arrive with a different appetite, a vendor who would push back on terms, or a sudden regulatory change that would make every memo a test. But the world of metal and airflow taught you to live with margin.